morning I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Mike Rollo. Dr. Mike and I have known each other for a number of years, but for the purposes of this, I think you should know that Mike has worked for over 30 years here in Asia, in the UK, New Zealand, in the public space, in the private space for ASX listed and private organizations and so on. And his wheelhouse, if you will, is really in that infrastructure development space. More recently, though, he's completed a PhD at the University of Sydney, a fantastic piece of groundbreaking research on the drivers of large-scale mega project success and failures and the sort of factors that contributed to that. And I'd urge all of you to check that out if you can. It really is a fantastic piece of work that he's done there. And he also is a great executive coach. And I'm delighted that you're joining us today, Mike. During lockdown, we, on Zoom, spent time doing a little video together and riffing on some management and leadership ideas and a trip down memory lane. I think I recall us talking about Taylorism back in the 20s and working our way through 100 years of sort of management ideas. And I know you've been sort of thinking more and more about that today as well. And today I think we're going to zero in on a particular debate that really hurts my mind every time you and I talk about it, which is the differences between complexity and complicated environments. And we'll try and tie that together into what it means for busy executives and how they might think about this in the work that they do. Before we get into it though, you know, this all starts with this idea, I think it was the US military that coined the term VUCA, this volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous environment. And listen, since you and I riffed together online during lockdown, we have lived through VUCA, right? Long before we knew any of this was happening. So why don't we just start the conversation with the environment and the sort of where we are now. Here we are at the end of 2022. We're sort of have been in VUCA and working our way through VUCA. So where's your mind at now before we really get into this conversation?
Well, just reflecting, I think VUCA is a military term for whatever reason, but we often hear now about managers talking about living in a VUCA world, where there are a whole lot of things that we can't control, things that are changing dramatically. They're volatile, uncertain, they're complex, and of course ambiguity of course is alive and around.
Yeah.
So managers' challenges of how do they deal with VUCA, and there's a lot of thought and conversations about, okay, what do we need to do? How do we deal with this VUCA world we're living in, assuming that it's here to stay?
Do you think it is here to stay?
Well, don't know. It's something we can't control it, so by definition we can't control it, so therefore it's around. And so some interesting work was done, research work done about managing complexity, where complexity is something that you can't control by a very simple definition, about 10 years ago, which said, okay, well, let's just be clear about the differences between what's complex and what's complicated. And the idea being that there are lots of things that we have to deal with as managers that are actually quite complicated. However, we should be able to manage them a lot easier than something that's complex.
So can I just stop you there? Just let me make sure I get this right. So the first difference between complexity and complicated is with complexity we can't control it. Is that the key idea?
Well, the definition of complexity was as it's something that we can't control. Up until about 2010, complexity and complicated meant the same thing.
Yes.
The research and the management theories all talked about something being complex or complicated as the same thing.
Interchangeable.
Interchangeable terms.
Right.
One of the researchers in Ireland, in fact, said, well, hang on a minute, let's look at the differences of, is there a difference between something that's complicated and something that's complex?
Yeah.
And if we accept that definition, that distinction, the argument is that, well, there are a whole lot of things that you'll face as a manager that you can actually probably deal with a lot easier than something that's complex.
So I was taught this idea several years ago, and the metaphor was flying a plane, and that a 747 is fiercely complicated. The wiring, the engineering, the electricity, it's a complicated piece of engineering. But what makes it complex is the performance and the interaction with human beings, right? The pilots and the crew, and because to your point, you can't with 100% certainty control that. With an aircraft, all conditions being stable, you know how the everything's going to connect and how it should perform in all conditions.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that was the difference that they pointed to. Is that the way that sort of think about this?
It's a good analogy. So flying a 747, it's very, very complicated.
Yep.
And you need a whole lot of highly skilled people, highly trained people to be able to manage that complication.
Right.
In addition to that, of course, there's a whole lot of complexity, volatility, uncertainty around flying a plane by the things that are outside of your control.
Right.
And one of the big ones, of course, is weather. And so how do we deal with managing weather? Well, we deal with managing weather. There's a whole methodology for doing that, scenario planning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the complex side of it.
Okay.
But not be spooked by all the complication. You can actually use management techniques. Now, what we're taught as managers about planning, organising, leading and controlling our businesses, those techniques work for complication.
Okay.
They're not so good for complexity, but they do actually work for complication. So the messages are, don't be spooked by what you're dealing with from the day-to-day world as a manager. Have a think about whether it's complex or complicated.
Okay. So I'm a busy exec. I'm under pressure. I've got 1,000 things going on. So is the first thing to just sort of be scanning for what are the things that are complicated versus complex? Is that a way to sort of approach this?
Yeah, if you can accept those definitions.
If you accept those definitions.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, so now let's keep peeling the onion here. So where do we go from here? So I've scanned. I've got. I accept your definition about control and uncontrollable and what's complex and complicated. So then, how do I now start to make use of this idea in a practical way in the work I do?
So the concept is, don't be frightened by things that are complicated. There are ways of dealing with that.
Okay.
However, things that are complex are not so good, right?
Okay.
So if we understand what risk management is and managing risk, and risks are defined as uncertainty, things that are uncertain that may have an impact on our business objectives. Mm-hmm. So to remove risks from your business is removing complexity from your business. Mm-hmm. And so part of the concept then is, okay, well, let's not remove the complicated bits because we can learn how to manage those, but we've probably got an idea to see what's complex, the uncertain bits, the volatile bits, and see if we can reduce those.
So we're trying to reduce the complexity through risk management. Yeah?
Well, risk management is, yes, absolutely all about reducing complexity.
Right, okay. And complication?
No, well, so the argument from this is, if you understand the distinction between the two, if you accept the distinction between the two, you don't need to reduce complication.
I see.
Because it's not uncertain.
Okay. And so where does the sort of so let's go further. So oftentimes when things feel complex or overwhelming or uncertain or what have you, the temptation is to control, for managers to exert more control, more reporting, more micromanaging, more measurement, more whatever, right? But we seek to create systems and structures to control. But actually, I don't know that the research bears that out, right? Doesn't the research talk to actually, this is where we actually need to actually loosen up and empower people to act within frameworks, but act, yeah? So let's unpack that a little bit more as well.
Sure.
How does that interact with all this?
So and it's interesting. So the research is suggesting that if you're trying to manage complexity, uncertainty, satisfactorily, then control's the wrong approach.
Right.
Because you can't control something you can't control.
So this is completely counterintuitive to the way we are hardwired, or at least the way I'm hardwired, right? And I suspect I'm not alone.
Yes. So again, if we accept the distinction, what's complex versus what's complicated, reducing complexity where you can, but don't try and use traditional management techniques to manage complexity, because you're managing something that's uncertain by trying to control it, and then you fall into what's called the paradox of control, where the more you try to control something you can't control, the less control you have of it.
Right.
So therefore the concept is to try and understand the difference, given this definition, as to what something, is it complicated or is it complex? And your 747 analogy is a good one. So if I can just play on that for a moment, if somebody who has got a driver's license to drive a car is put into a cockpit of a 747 aircraft, a whole lot of things that are complicated suddenly become complex, right?
Absolutely. And it's the aircraft is stable, and the introduction of the human is, yes, absolutely.
An untrained, unqualified human suddenly makes very complicated
go
things
wrong?
Complex.
Right. Okay. All right.
But you can, they're using that analogy, there are ways to actually train that individual to be able to make the complex things complicated, but no longer complex.
And of course, airlines do that.
Exactly.
With the processes where they regularly train their flight crews through simulators and constant testing and verification and blah, 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 to do exactly that.
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay. So can we just go back to this idea about our intuition is when we're in these sort of environments as managers and leaders is to seek to control and to lock down, right? And what we're saying is actually that's not what the evidence says and the research says, and it's completely counterintuitive. You've been a senior executive, you've been a CEO, you've been a COO, I mean, you've worked in all these complicated and complex environments in multiple countries around the world, and you now coach people. What's your sort of best advice, or how would you seek to work with a client or somebody that you're dealing with to help them with these sort of ideas? I mean,
well, the theory says, and the theory has been put into practice and tested, is that to manage something that's uncertain is you need to delegate and empower your team. The people closer to the uncertainty need to be empowered to deal with it quickly. And so that's communication, delegation, empowerment. And a lot of management schools and management training teach people about empowerment and trying the concepts of empowerment. What I've noticed though is many managers practice empowerment and fail. And what the research is suggesting is you can't have successful empowerment without control. And there's that control word again. And so what the theory says is it's empowerment with a level of control. So for example, if you empower somebody, say, okay, you can now employ people, and that person hasn't been trained on how to employ people effectively, properly, then they go off and make some mistakes. They employ people without proper qualifications or without doing reference checking, and suddenly you get a problem on your hand. Whereas empowering someone to employ people with control, for example, would be you have empowerment to go and employ people. However, the control is they have to fit within the salary bands that the company set, and they have to be tested through reference checking by at least 2 independent references. Suddenly you've got empowerment with, in that example, 2 forms of control. So the research is saying if you're going to empower your people, don't empower them without some form of control. Otherwise, you may not be very successful at managing complexity.
Okay, so we empower people, but we put some framework, some control, some scaffolding around. Is there anything in the research that also links this to, it's fine for you to empower me, but one of the other, whether it's control or scaffolding pieces that seems to me that is required is I have to be able to make decisions in the context of where I think we're heading. I.e., I've got to be clear about our goals, our strategy, our purpose, or all these sort of higher order things so that I can make decisions in the context of helping us, the organization, my team, go there, if you will. Is there anything in the research that talks to that, or is that sort of implied in the sort of giving people empowerment but with some control?
Well, it's the same concept, and empowerment without training is not a good idea, right? Because so if you're giving somebody a task that they haven't done before, or in a management level, and we've seen this in management organisations where someone is very, very successful at managing a business of a certain size and scale, they get promoted to a new role with much broader responsibilities, and they fail. And one of the reasons they fail is we forgot to train them. That it actually requires a whole lot of different skill sets, which is the car driver and the 747 pilot analogy.
So there you go. So part of this is about setting people up for success by making sure they've got the capabilities, the sort of the mindset, the perspectives, the skills
Yes, absolutely.
to be able to do this sort of higher level work.
Exactly, and that's where executive coaching fits in, and certainly my experience, having had executive coaches over through my career, is when you're promoted as an executive, you don't particularly want to tell your boss you don't know how to do the job, right? So having a third-party experienced coach and mentor can be very, very useful, because you can share with them your thoughts, your concerns, your vulnerability perhaps, that you may not particularly want to share with your boss in your new role that you've just been promoted into. So executive coaching, particularly in the first 6 months of taking up a new role, can be incredibly valuable because it helps you navigate through that.
Well, it's funny that you should say that, because one of my little hobby horses is this idea of no one ever, well, certainly I've never seen it and never experienced it myself. As we're promoted into different jobs, no one ever sits you down and says, congratulations, you know, you did a great job of this, this, and this, and that's why we're going to promote you into XYZ role. And all of those skills and capabilities that you've demonstrated in the previous role are absolutely necessary and insufficient for you to be successful in this next role. And the gap into the next role looks like this. And you're going to have to come to master A, B, C, and D to be successful in the next role. And be explicit with people about what that gap is, right? And some of these things that you're talking about are potentially some of the gaps to sort of deal with, whether it's complexity, complication, empowerment, providing the scaffolding, the controls, you know, all these sort of ideas.
Great idea, Chris.
Should do something with that.
Yeah. I mean, someone said, a wise man said to me once many years ago, Mike, we promoted you to do a different job.
Yeah.
Stop doing the job we promoted you from.
Oh, jeez.
Which is true.
Love that. Yeah, that's great.
So many of us do that. We're really good at our job, we get promoted, and we just keep doing the same job and not realising that perhaps it's actually a different role.
I liken it to, because we have this habit strength, and we're good at it, right? Because we've done that job, we've mastered that, right? But we have this habit strength, and so we reach back. We just quite, because of our good natures, and we want to, but we find we reach back and we do stuff that we oftentimes shouldn't be doing. But it's because we have a habit and we're able to do it, and we just kind of find ourselves reaching back and doing that rather than sort of maybe, helping, supporting, but not doing, and allowing others to do.
Yeah, letting go is not a bad skill.
Letting go is sort of do the job that you're hired to do, not the one you do. Yeah, good. Okay, so back to this idea. So we're sort of peeling this. Is there another level of this onion that we should get to today, do you think?
Well, it's just the theory is that empowerment's fantastic, but it's not just about empowerment, and it's empowerment with control, if I could use that.
Okay.
But you've got to have the right levels of control. So empowerment with too much control is not empowerment at all.
Right.
If our 747 pilot hits a bit of bad weather and he's got to ring head office to get permission to do something with the plane, that's empowerment with not a lot of control, right?
Right.
And so that
so
may
there's
not
a tension there.
That may not work.
Okay, so there's a tension between those two ideas: empowerment and control, and where are you on that continuum?
And I'm not an expert, of course, in flying Jumbo 7s, but I imagine if he's got to change altitude, he needs to tell someone he's changing altitude.
Yeah, and I suppose it's also probably situational. And I know we could talk about situational leadership, and maybe we do that at another date, but I'm gathering that it's probably situational, depending on the environment you're in as well.
Yeah. And there's an interesting story. It's a sad story. There's a gas platform in the North Sea of the UK called the Piper Alpha platform. Many people may know the story, but the platform caught fire, and in the end, unfortunately, I think over 160 people were killed, and billions of dollars of damage was done. Anyway, the root cause analysis was that the manager on the platform did not have approval to turn the gas off.
Oh, you're kidding.
And if he had had authority to turn the gas off, no one would have been killed.
Gosh.
But he had to go back to Aberdeen and then had to go back to London to get permission to turn the gas off. And so that was not empowerment, or it was empowerment with too much control. Whereas if he had, I'm just making this up, but if he had ability to turn the gas off in certain circumstances, then that was one of the findings. So that's an interesting example where we think we're empowering people, but maybe we're not. And I'm seeing many, many examples of that in management, where managers who love control and talk the good talk on empowerment actually don't really, it's empowerment with so much control. Yeah, you can make all those decisions, you've just got to check with me first.
So maybe this is a good call out for the managers and leaders and busy people that we deal with to just sort of do a bit of a reality check, a bit of a self-reflection, and really, ask themselves and think about, sort of where they are and that tension between those two ideas that we've been talking about, and just really sort of what sort of empowerment looks like and feels like for the people that they work with, and for themselves for that matter.
Well, that's right. It's successful empowerment done well makes your job a lot easier.
Yeah.
Empowerment done badly can be a disaster.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so empowerment with control is an interesting concept.
It's a very interesting concept.
And that helps build the trust, of course, because it's all about trust.
We're going to come back and talk about that on a different date.
For sure.
Hey, listen, so I'm a busy executive. I got 1,000 things going on. What are the 3 ideas you want me to walk away with from this conversation today, Mike?
So, accept the difference between something that's complex and something that's complicated. Use your management skills to manage things that are complicated with the appropriate controls in place.
Okay.
Try and reduce the levels of complexity, perhaps reduce them to being complicated, not complex, in other words, removing the uncertainty. If you still have uncertainty, and we all will have uncertainty to deal with, empowerment is the methodology. Empower the people closer to the uncertainty so they can be flexible and agile to make decisions. However, empower them with some controls, and then that'll lead to some great success.
Mike, that's 5 ideas, but for you, I'm going to give it to you. I love just being able to sort of riff on these ideas with you. You always hurt my brain, and thank you very much.
Very good, Chris. All the best.